Hello, everybody. Welcome. I am Benjamin Cohen, the news director at The Forward, and I am so excited to be joined today by the authors of this phenomenal book with a really eye-catching cover. It's called The American Way, A True Story of Nazi Escape, Superman, and Marilyn Monroe, and I'm joined by the two authors, Helene Stapinski and Bonnie Siegler. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Just so we can get our places. I'm in West Virginia. Helene, you're in Brooklyn.
Right.
And Bonnie, you're in Connecticut. So through the wonders of the internet, we can have this conversation. First of all, I want to say when I cannot recommend. It's not just because you guys are here. I love this book, and I cannot recommend it enough. And I want to tell all of our viewers to run, don't walk, to get this book. When I ordered it, I was like, literally, I was tracking the UPS. That's how crazy it was. And when the UPS guy came, I like ripped open the box and started reading it. I mean, it's just you know, we have so many books in the canon of Holocaust books. And as you're both well aware, many of them are very somber books. They take place in Germany, and it's like a whole other world. And then you guys are like, no, we're gonna make it, American pop culture. It's almost, I heard someone refer to it as like a feel-good Holocaust book. Is that how you guys would describe it?
Star-studded, uplifting Holocaust book. How's that?
Yeah, we refer to it as our Trojan horse. It's a Holocaust book for people who don't want to read a Holocaust book. They don't know that it's a Holocaust book. It's sort of sandwiched in between Marilyn Monroe and Superman. But it's in there. It's in the deep center. So
I want to see if I can just give like a brief synopsis, and you can fill in the blanks. But it's basically, the story is about how the publisher of DC Comics, that's Superman, helped save a Jewish family from Nazi Germany, and how they came over to the States and what happened to them when they arrived in the States. And it includes a really cool opening story that Marilyn Monroe is involved in. Does one of you want to tell us about that opening story?
I actually couldn't hear you because your sound.
I'll go. Basically, the story that started the book, and that I wrote for the New York Times, and which is now the first chapter, more or less, is Bonnie's grandfather, Jules, came to America in 1954. He was living on the Upper East Side, and he was there the night that Marilyn Monroe's dress blew up on the subway grate.
Wait, he came in 1938. But
he came in 38, but the shot was in 54. And so he was there with his camera, and his footage is the last remaining film footage from that night on that street corner. So
because they were filming a movie that night.
They were
7-Year Itch.
Yeah, they were filming the 7-Year Itch, and they were hoping to use the footage, but because the press had alerted people to come for kind of a PR event, it was really crowded, and there were lots of people screaming. And the other thing that happened is Joe DiMaggio was upset because Marilyn's dress was blowing above her head and men were screaming at her. And so Joe got very upset, and that night he beat her up a little. He roughed her up a little, and she left him the next day. And then they decided to shoot this scene in California because they couldn't use the footage in New York, which is why the only film that exists of that night is my grandfather's.
So were you told growing up, was this kind of like some family lore that your grandfather had this footage?
Yeah. I heard about it a lot, actually, but I never seen it. And so finding it in 2005 was the real aha moment.
Did you guys believe him, or was it like, oh, okay, granddad, whatever?
He filmed a lot. He had his camera out a lot. So he really was into preserving the moment and appreciating the moment of being here, being alive, being in America, all that good stuff. So that was very much like him, but it could have been accidentally thrown away or lost, or anything could have happened. So I didn't know if I would ever actually find it, but I did.
Yeah. And so you found it, and then Helene, you mentioned that this book started off as a New York Times article that you wrote, and then it became the genesis for the book. What's the process, Helene, of working, and you've written books before this, what's the process of writing this book together, A, with somebody else, and B, with someone who is part of that family of the story in the book?
Well, I had never written a book with someone before. So I knew Bonnie already going into the project. If I didn't know her and wasn't friends with her and didn't realize that it would be a good thing, I probably wouldn't have done it because I've never written a big thing like that with anyone.
There were 2 years between the article and starting the book. So we just remained friends.
We were friends.
And
so I figured it would be okay. And so Bonnie did a lot of the research, especially the family research. You know, she did research with Yad Vashem. She did research with the Holocaust Museum in DC on ancestry. She did all of the family research pretty much. And then a lot of the other research too. And so she would just basically shovel me information constantly. She was like, you know, had a shovel and throw it my way to the point where I'd be like, Bonnie, stop. You know, because I was trying to organize it and get the narrative flow and figure out what was going to go where. But that was generally the breakdown. Bonnie like throwing stuff my way and me catching it and writing, you know. So that was 2 years of that.
Yeah.
So.
And you wrote this during the pandemic. Was that tough?
It's actually, it's what, if you ask, what did you do during the pandemic? This is it.
What we did. This was it. Yeah. It was actually great for me. I mean, it was great to have a project, you know. Everybody in my house was working on something and, you know, everybody went to their own computer every day and worked. So that was great. The hard part about the pandemic was that you couldn't go places and do the research. So everything had to be done online, and a lot of stuff is online. For instance, the Superman stuff, there was an archive at Columbia University, and I would have liked to have just gone to Columbia since I'm in New York, but you couldn't go there and do that. And so the woman in charge of that comic archive had to hold stuff up for us, like on Zoom, and show us stuff from like 1,000 boxes, you know, and ask us what we wanted copied, and she'd copy it and email it to us. So that was a problem. And then we also wanted to go to Berlin to do research because that's where Jules came from. And Bonnie pushed, and finally Berlin opened. I thought Bonnie was going to, you know, go to the German embassy and make them take us, but they finally opened up the end of our process, and we went, and it was amazing. And it sort of added much color to the book.
Well, every, I mean, I'm sure you know, Berlin was destroyed, but every building my ancestors lived in survived for some reason. So we were able to see all the locations, you know, everywhere they went, basically.
Yeah, it was kind of a miracle.
Yeah. You talked about the comics angle to this, the DC Comics angle and Superman. Tell us about how the publisher of the comics got involved with Bonnie's family.
Well, a cousin of my grandfather's, who he didn't know because she lived in America and he had only lived in Germany, she lived in the Bronx next door to a man named Harry Donenfeld in the early 30s. They became friendly, they stayed friends, and then Harry became much more successful. But he actually signed the papers for my grandfather the same week the very first issue of Superman came out, which was in April 1938. Even though the date on Action Comics #1, for anyone paying close attention, says June 1938, it came out in April.
Right. They would give it a couple of months to sort of percolate on the newsstands, you know. So, but he already had money from bootlegging, from girly pulps and stuff like that. But the comics really sent him into the stratosphere. That made him a multimillionaire. So,
yeah, he was doing all sorts of other kinds of magazines, and
But this comic, he lucked out really with Superman. He was just trying other things. And he didn't really even believe in that first issue. He didn't know if he liked the car over the guy's head. But okay, we'll try it. And it, of course, to this day is still known around the world. Zelensky dressed up as Superman for Halloween.
Right. So I learned a lot about specifically Superman when I was reading your book. I didn't realize that, you know, nowadays we think of, you know, Marvel movies or whatever, you know, they're just fight him up, you know, bad guy, good guy. But I didn't realize Superman was such, like, I don't know if I would call it like a justice warrior. Like, he had causes. Like, I know the U.S. military used him as kind of a mascot during the war. There were several, I think you talked about several issues where Superman is fighting Nazis and bringing Hitler to justice. I think I wrote down, you said Hitler was featured on 100 covers. Goebbels was on one cover. Santa was sent to a concentration camp. On one radio show, Superman battles the KKK.
Yeah.
I mean, I never realized that there was this whole other societal, context to it.
Harry was like a communist back in the 20s, and so Superman was a left-wing warrior, basically. He was fighting for truth, justice, and the American way, and everything in between. He was fighting for good housing for people. He was fighting against political corruption. You name it, whatever social cause that the left is for, he was fighting for back then in the 30s and 40s, and then of course against Hitler. So
and Harry and Jack, who owned DC Comics, basically. They were both Jewish. Jerry and Joe, who created it, were Jewish. I mean, they were all on the same side fighting this one.
Right. And then there's this, I don't know about irony, but like there's this like, it's almost like it's like a Hollywood story. It's like the guy who is, popularizing Superman is also saving Jews in real life. So he himself was like an actual Superman in some respects.
Right. I mean, we've really brought Harry back because of all of his history and the fact that he was arrested a number of times, et cetera, and was investigated and was involved with the mob and a few other things. He was sort of written out of DC's history. So he wasn't really seen as that superhero. But so we've gotten to see kind of the side of him that was also a mensch. We know he was very good to the Jewish community, gave jobs to anyone who asked, helped out anyone who asked, and donated to a lot of Jewish causes. But nobody knew about this.
What do you think motivated him to, there wasn't really money in it for him. He was obviously a shrewd businessman, but there wasn't money in saving, this family.
No, but there was no money involved either. He didn't have to pay anything.
He didn't have to do anything. Yeah. It was just a matter of filling out a form,
And I'm sure Faye made a good case for why it was important.
Yeah.
And I think people of that stature, who were aware of what was happening in Nazi Germany, did step up. I know Margaret Sanger, we talk about in the book, was friends with Harry. She saved a bunch of Jewish people from Europe. I think anybody who was in that position did it, tried to do it anyway. So it probably wasn't that unusual, but yeah, I mean, if you could, you did, right?
Especially if a pretty young friend came to you and asked you really nicely with her 10-year-old son, who got to see the first issue of Superman before it went out.
Yeah, I was picturing like Mrs. Maisel coming to his office is what that scene looked like to me.
I like that.
To me, like as we said at the beginning, it's amazing how 80 years after the Holocaust, that there's still new Holocaust stories to tell. I right before I finished reading your book, I read the book by Jonathan Friedland, the Guardian reporter, who wrote a book about the first Jew to escape Auschwitz, one of the first and only Jews to ever escape Auschwitz. And I'm like, I've known about the Holocaust since I was a kid, and like your story, I'd never heard this story. How is it possible that we still have a
lot of people, including everyone in my family, didn't talk about it. And you see a lot of people, they, wait until the very last moment. Okay, I'll talk about it now. And that happened for a lot of people. But I knew all the people in this book, but I didn't know their stories. So I never asked either.
The other thing is that all these Holocaust stories, every one of them is incredible. You know what I mean? Anybody who got out, and I'm sure people who didn't get out, stories were incredible too. But every story is just an amazing story. Everyone you come across, I teach a class where I have the students interview Holocaust survivors, kids who don't really know much about the Holocaust, and they meet these survivors who are actually, in their 80s, 90s, sometimes as high as 100, and every story is just mind blowing, and to get that firsthand from these people and to hear their stories is just an amazing thing. So,
do you think, 10 years from now, when there's far fewer Holocaust survivors, that finding these stories is going to be harder?
Well, I'm still around.
Right.
The other thing is that a lot of them are recorded, and Bonnie found a bunch from her family members who she didn't know their stories. They're dead now, but they had come to America, and Yad Vashem recorded some of them. I don't know, what are some other places, Bonnie, that recorded them? Do you know?
At Yale recorded, like Don Reddig's story. Don had passed that amazing escape story where he pretended to be drunk on the train. I don't know if you remember it.
Yeah.
We learned the whole thing from his show-a-tape. I mean, it was him telling us for 2 hours what happened to him.
Yeah,
it was phenomenal.
It is out there. So when I was researching the book, for instance, if I had a scene, particularly during the Holocaust, where we didn't have someone in Bonnie's family to tell us or a tape of them, I would do research into people who were there at the very same time, the very same place, and look at those tapes and see what their experiences were like,
Yeah, I think I was reading your book and there's a scene, I don't remember where, but like maybe a couple scenes where you were talking about like the linoleum floor or whatever the floor looked like or the drapes looked like. And I was like, how does she know all these details? It was pretty mind-boggling.
Well, we interviewed everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody. And in Berlin, we were there. We went into all the buildings, and then we had tons of photography. I mean, there's only one picture per chapter, but there was a lot more.
Yeah. One of the fun parts of your book was just seeing all the cameos. Miss America makes a cameo, and we talked to Billy Wilder makes a cameo, Joe DiMaggio makes a cameo. And then as it was, going further into present day, and then Donald Trump makes a cameo with Edith's Garden. Can you tell us about that?
I mean, I remember that really well because I was around for that one. This building was going up. It was just a nightmare. It didn't belong in the neighborhood, and it was going to be
where, just so our listeners understand, this is where your grandparents, where they lived.
On 61st between Lex and 3rd, and the 7-Year Itch house is across the street, the house that the movie takes place in. And then down the street on their side on the corner was this high-rise going up, and they really fought it. They got the whole neighborhood together to fight it, but lost. And the building went up. It was made horribly. I mean, things fell off the building, and a person fell off the building and died.
One of the construction workers fell off, and his body parts scattered through the neighborhood. It was not a good project in general. And then you find out at the end of the chapter who the developer is, and it's Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So we had to get him in there somehow.
Well, speaking of Trump, I was listening to an interview. I think, Helene, you were saying, was it Helene or I think it was Bonnie actually, who was saying how when Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, you were looking for a way to tell this story, and how did that connect with the Trump era?
I mean, all of a sudden, for the first time in my life, there were very fine people on both sides. There were never very fine people on both sides before, and it looked bad. I mean, it's a very slow slide to fascism, as we're seeing right now, and it freaked me out. But I'm a graphic designer. Like, what could I do? But I had this story about the Holocaust, and all these fun things around it. Marilyn is a good lead-in to any story. Like, oh, look at Marilyn and this amazing story. So it really was like a Trojan horse. But at the time, it was get it in the New York Times. Why isn't the New York Times talking about how this is like 1933? What is going on? And so that was the impetus for putting the article in the Times. And sharing the Marilyn film, everything. All it was about was, let's just start talking about this in the right way.
Yeah.
Up until fairly recently,
up until fairly recently, and Bonnie said this before, the Nazis were always bad, and now not so much, right? What? Why are you saying? What are you saying? So that was her goal, to get it out there.
People will see this book on the shelf, they'll see The American Way, and the first thing you're going to think of is, truth, justice, and the American way, the Superman motto. But there's other meanings to the American way, and I'm wondering, Helene, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, each meaning we have has sort of a back end to it, right? So the American way is America opening its arms to immigrants and bringing them in and having a new home in America, right? But America also keeps them at bay, right? As we know today, it's still happening, happens all the time. It pushed people away during the war. People died because of it. The American way was, Jerry and Joe, who created Superman, having, this superhero in popular culture and becoming famous from it. But also they got screwed by Harry Donenfeld on their contract, were paid like $130 and lost their rights to it. That's the American way, So, and Marilyn too, she was famous and she came up from nothing and she had this wonderful, career in Hollywood, but she died sad and alone of a drug overdose or whatever the circumstances were. That's also the American way, so everything has double meaning.
It's ironic.
Yes.
Yeah. Bonnie, can you tell us about the end of your grandfather's life? So he had been, rescued by the publisher of Superman. He moves to America. He starts a family here. And at the end of his life kind of takes a turn when his wife becomes ill. Tell us about that.
My grandmother had a stroke and she was half paralyzed and in a wheelchair, and the doctors said it was the end and she should stay in the hospital and I'm so sorry kind of thing. And my grandfather said, if it's the end, I'm bringing her home. And he took care of her for 25 years until she passed. I mean, everybody in the neighborhood knew them. He took her everywhere in the wheelchair. He was the mayor of the block. He still took care of everyone else on the block also. He was a really great guy. And then a few years after she passed, he was evicted from his apartment, which was a whole other story. But we got him a new, because he was only paying the amount of money he got in reparations. That was his rent, because somebody was really nice to him and gave him this great apartment for very cheap. So the foundation that evicted him had to find him another apartment that was similar, and he paid the same amount.
But when Bonnie helped him move, that's when she found the footage of Marilyn Monroe.
So in 2005. I found it really touching how you described how your grandfather Jules paid it forward, helping other Nazi refugees. I think you pointed out like Superman himself, he was like the lone survivor of Krypton. And he became a caretaker of your grandmother, but he just became like a leader in the Jewish community and making people aware of people that are suffering and helping those that are suffering.
Yeah, he did little things. Somebody needed somebody to pick up their prescription, an old person, and he would go and get the prescription for them. Little things, but they all add up, And
we like to say not all superheroes wear capes.
Right. That's a perfect way to say it. Right. So Bonnie, what's one thing you hope people take away from your grandfather's story?
Oh my gosh. I mean, there's so many things, but
really, a few things.
I think the one thing that I keep saying is I think I want people to talk to their relatives. I really regret at my advanced age that in all those opportunities, I didn't. I knew Holocaust stories and I knew everyone left Germany, but I never said, tell me your story. I really regret that. And I encourage everybody else to do what I didn't do.
Mm-hmm. And Helene, what do you hope people take away from this book?
Well, I keep saying that the message of the book is love, against all this hate, in the middle of the Holocaust, in the middle of the war, in the middle of what's happening now in the world. The answer is hate. Is love. Sorry. And Julie is the proponent of that. He loved everybody around him, and helped people. And that's the answer. It's an old story. It's kind of a cliche, but it's true. So that's what I hope people come away with. Not hate, love.
Not hate, love. Like I said, I mean, this cover does not attract people. It's got superheroes, Nazis, Marilyn Monroe. It's got everything.
A little tiny Hitler.
You see the Hitler head? There's a tiny Hitler head.
I do see the Hitler head right there.
Right there
I didn't notice that until now.
We didn't want to give him big billing, but Bonnie designed that cover and the inside. So.
Oh, it's really cool. It's almost like Andy Warhol. I mean, it's just like very pop.
Yeah, it's great.
These are Joe, the two guys
Joe.
on the bottom.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, is there anything else you guys would like to add before we wrap up?
I think you covered it.
Covered everything.
Amazingly, okay. You covered it all.
Like I said, I cannot recommend this book enough. I devoured it. I think like in 2 days. It's just good. It's a good book. It's a feel good Holocaust book, but it's like, I'm a pop culture guy, and it just had everything that just hit all the right notes for me. So really, it's called The American Way: A True Story of Nazi Escape, Superman and Marilyn Monroe. It came out a few weeks ago. It's now available wherever you get your books. Bonnie, Helene, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a delight.
Thank you. Great interview. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.